Joe shuffled down the cracked sidewalk, his worn-out shoes barely holding together. The city was bustling with life. Businessmen in pressed suits hurried past, young professionals sipped overpriced coffee, and shoppers carried bags filled with designer items, but no one spared him a glance. To them, he was invisible, just another homeless man blending into the background of the city's indifference. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten anything substantial in over a day. He had managed to find half a sandwich in a garbage bin earlier, but it had only teased his hunger rather than satisfying it. He pulled his tattered coat tighter around himself, though it did little to block the chilly wind cutting through the streets. As he walked past a high-end restaurant, the rich aroma of grilled steak and freshly baked bread wafted through the air. His mouth watered, but he knew better than to linger too long. The last time he had stood near a place like this, the manager had threatened to call the cops, accusing him of scaring away customers. He had learned to keep moving, to avoid trouble. Despite his efforts to stay unnoticed, trouble had a way of finding people like him. A sudden loud voice behind him made him tense. "Hey you, stop right there." Joe turned slowly and saw a group of uniformed police officers approaching. Their expressions were hard, their body language aggressive. He had seen them before, officers who had a reputation for harassing the homeless. They saw people like him as a nuisance, as if having nowhere to go was a crime in itself. "What are you doing around here?" one of them asked, stepping closer. His name tag read, Officer Reynolds, and his sharp eyes scanned Joe with clear disdain. Joe met his gaze, but said nothing. He had learned that speaking up often made things worse. Reynolds smirked. "What cat got your tongue? You're not causing trouble, are you?" Another officer, a taller one with a stocky build, chuckled. "Nah, he's just looking for scraps, probably hoping some rich folks will throw him a few bucks." The others laughed, their amusement at Joe's expense ringing through the air. He clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, but forced himself to remain calm. Reacting would only give them an excuse to escalate things further. "Let's see what you've got on you," Reynolds said, stepping closer. Before Joe could respond, the officer roughly grabbed his arm and spun him around. "Hey," Joe protested, but the officer shoved him against the cold brick wall of a nearby building. "Relax," Reynolds said, mockingly. "Just making sure you're not carrying anything illegal." They patted him down, their hands digging into his pockets, pulling out what little he had, some crumpled bills, a few coins, and an old photograph. One officer snatched the picture and glanced at it before laughing and tossing it to the ground. "Ah, is this your family? Too bad they're not here to help you," he sneered. Joe gritted his teeth, anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but he knew better than to lash out. He had seen what happened to others who dared to resist, beaten, arrested, sometimes worse. One of the officers knocked off Joe's hat, exposing his unkempt hair. "You smell like a damn dumpster," he said, waving his hand in front of his nose as the others chuckled. Joe bent down to pick up his picture, ignoring the pain in his ribs from being shoved. As he straightened, he met Reynolds' eyes and, for the first time, allowed a hint of something unreadable to flicker across his expression. The officer frowned, as if sensing something was off, but quickly shook it off. To them, he was just another homeless man, another nameless face they could push around without consequence. Joe, however, knew something they didn't, and soon they would learn the truth. Reynolds smirked as he held up Joe's worn-out backpack, shaking it like it contained something dangerous. "Let's see what kind of treasures you're hiding in here." Without waiting for a response, he unzipped the bag and dumped its contents onto the sidewalk. A few old clothes, a paperback novel with pages barely holding together, and a dented tin cup clattered to the ground. The officers laughed, as if they had just discovered something pathetic. "This is all you've got?" One of them scoffed. "No wonder you're out here begging." Joe clenched his jaw, but remained silent. He had learned long ago that arguing only gave men like this more reason to escalate. Reynolds nudged the book with his boot. "What's this? You planning to educate yourself?" He chuckled before kicking it toward the curb. Another officer picked up Joe's tin cup and made a show of pretending to beg. "Spare some change, please, sir. I haven't eaten in days," he mocked, making exaggerated facial expressions as the others burst into laughter. Then, without warning, he tossed the cup into a nearby trash can. Joe exhaled slowly, watching as the last of his few possessions were tossed away like garbage. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it never got easier. Then Reynolds grabbed Joe's arm again, pulling him forward. "You know what? I'm getting real tired of seeing you around here. Maybe it's time we take you in." Joe met his eyes calmly. "On what charge?" Reynolds' expression darkened. "Loitering, disturbing the peace." "Hell, I'm sure we'll think of something." A few bystanders had gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves. Some had their phones out, recording. It was becoming harder for police officers to act without consequence, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try. A woman in a business suit hesitated before speaking up. "He hasn't done anything. Why are you harassing him?" Reynolds turned to her, his expression hard. "Ma'am, this is police business. Move along." The woman hesitated, but ultimately stepped back, clearly not wanting to get involved further. Others in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others shaking their heads. Joe noticed their hesitation. They saw what was happening, but fear kept them silent. It wasn't their fight, and they didn't want trouble. Reynolds turned back to Joe and smirked. "No one's gonna help you." He shoved him backward, making Joe stumble. Still Joe remained calm. His silence, his lack of fear, seemed to irritate the officers. They were used to people begging, resisting, or at least showing some sign of distress. But Joe simply stared at them, his face unreadable, and that, more than anything, made them uneasy. They didn't realize that the man they were treating like dirt was far more powerful than they could ever imagine. As the officers continued their cruel display, a voice called out from across the street, "Hey, what's going on here?" An older man, wearing an apron stained with coffee and flour, stepped out of a small bakery. His sharp eyes landed on Joe, and recognition flickered across his face. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked briskly toward them. "Let him go," the man said firmly. Reynolds turned, raising an eyebrow. "And who the hell are you?" "The name's Martin," the shop owner replied, "and I know exactly who this man is." He glanced at Joe, as if silently asking if he was all right. Reynolds smirked. "Oh yeah, he your long-lost cousin or something?" The other officers chuckled. Martin ignored the sarcasm. "I'm telling you, you don't want to do this. You're making a big mistake." One of the younger officers scoffed. "A mistake? Please, this guy is just another bum. What, you feel sorry for him because he buys your stale pastries?" Martin's jaw tightened. "You think he's just a homeless man? I'm warning you, let him go now, or you'll regret it." The officers exchanged amused looks before breaking into laughter. Reynolds wiped a fake tear from his eye. "Oh no, we're so scared. Is he some kind of secret agent?" Another officer nudged Joe's shoulder mockingly. "Hey buddy, you got a hotline to the mayor. Maybe you can call the governor and get us all fired." Joe simply smiled, a small knowing smile that made Reynolds' amusement falter for a fraction of a second. "I don't need to call anyone," Joe said, his voice calm. "Soon enough you'll understand why." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. He didn't like the way Joe spoke, as if he knew something they didn't, but he quickly shook it off and let out a short laugh. "Sure, whatever you say, buddy." He turned to Martin. "You should get back to your little bakery before we start thinking you're obstructing police business." Martin opened his mouth to say something but then sighed, shaking his head. He gave Joe one last look before stepping back. "I tried to warn you," he muttered before walking away. Reynolds turned back to Joe, his smirk returning. Well, looks like your one friend couldn't save you. He stepped closer. Now what were you saying about us regretting this? Joe met his gaze with quiet confidence. You'll see. Reynolds scoffed and shoved him once more. Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. None of them realized that the moment of reckoning was closer than they thought. Just as Reynolds was about to shove Joe again, the low hum of an expensive engine filled the air. A sleek black luxury car, polished to perfection, pulled up to the curb. The crowd, which had been cautiously observing from a distance, turned their heads in curiosity. Even the officers momentarily paused, their attention drawn to the vehicle. The back door opened, and a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit stepped out. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, but there was a certain authority in the way he moved. He adjusted his cufflinks before scanning the scene. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked directly toward Joe. "Sir," he said with unmistakable respect, offering a slight nod. "Are you all right?" Reynolds frowned. He exchanged confused glances with his fellow officers before letting out a scoffing laugh. "Sir, you talking to him?" The assistant ignored the officers entirely, focusing only on Joe. "We've been looking for you. The board was concerned when you hadn't checked in." Joe dusted himself off, taking his time before responding. "I had some interesting experiences," he said, his voice calm. One of the younger officers, clearly confused, muttered, "What the hell is going on?" The assistant turned to them with an unreadable expression. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing?" Reynolds crossed his arms, still amused. "Oh, let me guess. He's some long-lost prince." Joe sighed and finally spoke. "Joseph Langford," he said, watching as the officers' faces remained blank. "Founder of Langford Enterprises, CEO, billionaire." For a moment, there was silence. Then, as recognition dawned, the officers' expressions shifted, from amusement to disbelief, then to outright panic. The color drained from Reynolds' face. No way," he stammered. Joe tilted his head slightly. "You really should do your research before mistreating people," he said. The weight of their mistakes settled heavily on them. The man they had humiliated, shoved, and mocked wasn't just some nameless homeless person. He was one of the most powerful men in the country, and now, their fate was in his hands. The weight of silence pressed down on the officers as the realization sank in. The homeless man they had humiliated, shoved, and mocked was none other than Joseph Langford, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the country. The amused smirks had vanished from their faces, replaced by unease and growing panic. Joe dusted off his coat, glancing at the assistant. "Contact the commissioner. I want a full internal investigation into the conduct of these officers." Reynolds took a step forward, his confidence cracking. "Wait, sir, Mr. Langford, there's no need for that. This was just a misunderstanding." Joe's gaze was unwavering. "A misunderstanding." His voice was calm, but there was a cold edge to it. "You harassed me, threw away my belongings, and threatened me with false charges. You think that's just a misunderstanding?" One of the younger officers, now visibly sweating, stammered, "We didn't know who you were." Joe let out a short breath, more disappointed than angry. "That's exactly the problem. If I were just a homeless man, would that have made your actions acceptable?" Before they could respond, the sound of another vehicle approaching drew their attention. A black and white police cruiser pulled up, and a senior officer stepped out, Captain Harris, their commanding officer. His sharp eyes swept over the scene, taking in Joe, the shaken officers, and the gathering crowd. Harris's face darkened. "What the hell is going on here?" Joe's assistant stepped forward. "These officers have been mistreating Mr. Langford, under the assumption that he was homeless. We have witnesses, and I've already contacted the commissioner." Harris's expression twisted in horror as he turned to Reynolds and his team. "Tell me this isn't true." The officers looked at each other, searching for a defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. The crowd, which had grown in number, started speaking up. "I filmed the whole thing," one woman said, holding up her phone.
They pushed him, threw his things in the trash, another bystander added. A man in a suit scoffed, and they laughed about it. Real professionals, huh? Harris's face turned red with fury. You idiots, do you have any idea what you've done? Reynolds tried one last time. Captain, please, but Harris cut him off with a sharp glare. Shut up. Joe studied the officers, now pale and desperate. He saw the fear in their eyes, the same fear they had tried to instill in him when they thought he was powerless. One of them, the youngest, spoke up with a pleading voice. Mr. Langford, please, we made a mistake. Joe held up a hand, silencing him. You weren't concerned about mistakes when you were humiliating me. Now that you're facing consequences, you're sorry. Reynolds swallowed hard. Please, sir, if you report this, our careers. Joe's expression was firm. Justice has to be served. Not just for me, but for every person you've mistreated who didn't have the power to fight back. The officers realized then that there would be no mercy. Their fate was sealed. The fallout was swift and severe. Within days, an internal investigation confirmed everything. Officer Reynolds and his team had a long history of harassing the homeless, abusing their authority, and falsifying charges. With overwhelming evidence, including video footage from bystanders and Joe's own testimony, the officers were immediately suspended. A week later, they were fired. The public outrage was immense. News outlets picked up the story, and social media erupted with discussions about police misconduct and the treatment of the homeless. The mayor, under pressure from both activists and the general public, announced a series of reforms aimed at improving the way the city handled homelessness. New policies were implemented. Officers were required to undergo additional training on human rights and ethical policing. A new task force was formed to ensure fair treatment of all citizens, regardless of their socio-economic status. But for Joe, policy changes weren't enough. He wanted real, tangible improvements in people's lives. Using his vast wealth and influence, Joe donated millions to local shelters, ensuring they had enough resources to provide food, medical care, and housing assistance. He funded job training programs, helping people get back on their feet instead of being left to fend for themselves. He even purchased several vacant buildings, transforming them into clean, safe living spaces for those in need. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. What had started as a shocking revelation soon turned into a movement, inspiring other wealthy individuals to contribute to similar causes. Change was happening, not just in policy, but in the hearts and minds of the people. Yet, despite all the progress, Joe knew that real change required constant vigilance. So one evening, he donned his old tattered coat once more, and walked the streets as he had before. The city felt different. The looks of disgust from passers-by were fewer, replaced instead with nods of acknowledgement or quiet respect. He saw officers treating homeless individuals with more care, offering resources rather than threats. Shelters were fuller, not with desperation, but with hope. As he passed by Martin's bakery, the shop owner spotted him and grinned. Back at it again, huh? Joe simply smiled. Just making sure things stay on the right path. Martin chuckled. Well, if anyone can make sure of that, it's you. Joe nodded and continued his walk, blending into the city once more. Not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as someone who believed in change and was willing to make it happen.